After studying this module, you shall be able to know about gender identity and its conceptual origins, the factors that influence the development of gender identity, and the development of gender identity during adolescence. Gender identity is a person's private sense and subjective experience of their own gender. This is generally described as one's private sense of being a man or a woman, consisting primarily of the acceptance of membership into a category of people, male or female. All societies have a set of gender categories that can serve as the basis of the formation of a social identity in relation to other members of society. In most societies, there is a basic division between gender attributes assigned to males and females. In all societies, however, some individuals do not identify with some or all of the aspects of gender that are assigned to their biological sex. Gender identity is usually formed by age 3 and is extremely difficult to change after that. The formation can also commonly conclude between the ages of 4 and 6. Gender identity is affected by influence of others, social interactions, and a child's own personal interests. Understanding gender can be broken down into 4 parts: understanding the concept of gender, learning gender role standards and stereotypes, and identifying with parents and forming gender preference. A 3-year-old can identify themselves as a boy or a girl, though they do not yet fully understand the implications of gender. Gender identity is formed as children search for social cues and display approval for others based upon the gender with which the child identifies, though gender identity is very fluid among young children. Studies suggest that children develop gender identity in 3 distinct stages. As toddlers and preschoolers, they learn about defined characteristics which are socialized aspects of gender. The second stage is consolidation, in which identity becomes rigid around the ages 5 to 7 years. After this peak of rigidity, fluidity returns and socially defined gender roles relax somewhat. The conceptual origin of gender identity. Sigmund Freud in 1905, who was an influential 20th century psychologist, also known as the father of psychoanalysis, he presented his theory of psychosexual development in 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. Freud gave evidence to the fact that in the pregenital phase, children do not distinguish between genders or sexes. They assume both parents have the same genitalia and the same reproductive powers. On this basis, he inferred that bisexuality is the original sexual orientation and that heterosexuality is resultant of repression during the phallic stage, at which point gender identity is ascertainable. According to Freud, during this stage, children develop an Oedipus complex where they have sexual fantasies for the parent ascribed the opposite gender and hatred for the parent ascribed the same gender. This hatred, transference, and identification with the hated parent, who both exemplifies a model to appease sexual impulses and threatens to castrate the child's powers to appease sexual impulses. In 1913, Jung proposed the Electropus complex, as he both believed that bisexuality did not lie at the origin of psychic life and that Freud did not give adequate description to the female child. This proposal, however, was rejected by Freud. During the 50s and 60s, psychologists began studying gender development in young children, partially in an effort to understand the origins of homosexuality, which was viewed as a mental disorder at the time. In 1958, the Gender Identity Research Project was established at the UCLA Medical Center for the study of intersex and transsexuals. Psychoanalyst Stoller generalized many of the findings of the project in his book, Sex and Gender, on the development of masculinity and femininity. He is also credited with introducing the term gender identity to the International Psychoanalytic Congress in Stockholm, Sweden in 1963. Behavioral psychologist Money was also instrumental in the development of early theories of gender identity. His works at Johns Hopkins Medical School's Gender Identity Clinic popularized an interactionist theory of gender identity, suggesting that up to a certain age, gender identity is relatively fluid and subject to constant negotiation. His book, Man and Woman, Boy and Girl, became widely used as a college textbook, although many of Money's ideas have since been challenged. In the late 80s, Judith Butler began lecturing regularly on the topic of gender identity and in 1990 published her seminal work Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, which imported significant contributions from philosophy after the late 1950s and led to a radical critique of the inadequacies in feminism. Butler's central thesis argues that gender identity does not oppose sexual biology, but on the contrary performs the possibility of something otherwise than male or female. Gender Trouble is often regarded as the most groundbreaking work on feminist theory and gender studies. While the term gender identity generally refers to gender and sex categories, other scholars additionally use the term to refer the sexual orientation and sexual identity categories, that is gay, lesbian, bisexual. There are many factors influencing the development of gender identity. First, we'll talk about the biological factors. Gender identity has been found to be related to genetic or hormonal influences. The biochemical theory of gender identity suggests that we acquire our gender identities through genetic and hormonal factors rather than through socialization. In the article by Birke titled In Pursuit of Difference, Scientific Studies of Women and Men, it is suggested that sex-determining hormone is produced at the early stage of fetal development. Ovaries and testes produce hormones and testes produce higher levels of certain hormones than do ovaries. If the levels of androgens are high, then a penis and scrotum will develop. If they are low, then labia and a clitoris will develop. When prenatal hormone levels are altered, phenotype progression may be altered as well. Therefore, the natural predisposition of the brain toward one sex may not match the genetic makeup of the fetus or its external sexual organs. Numerous conditions and variations that have their basis in the prenatal stage can ultimately affect one's gender identity. Possible conditions may result from chromosomal alterations in which the child does not have the normal 2 chromosomes of XX for female or XY for male. In addition to the hormonal influences on gender identity, genes also play a significant role. For human beings, thousands of genes are inherited from their parents and arranged into 23 pairs of chromosomes. One of them is a pair of sex chromosomes. Females usually have 2 X's, so each egg they produce contains 1 X. Males usually have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome, so that each individual sperm can have either an X or a Y. However, having a Y chromosome does not necessarily mean that a person is a male. It is the genes on the Y chromosome that determine whether the human being will have the masculine pathway or not. It is a common mistake when people assume a Y chromosome makes a person a boy or a man, and the lack of a Y chromosome makes a person a girl or a woman. For example, a physician had the challenging experience of trying to calm a 23-year-old patient who had just been told by a resident that she was really a man, because the resident had diagnosed the patient as having a Y chromosome and complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. As a matter of fact, it is the SRY gene on the tip of the Y chromosome that helps to send the embryo down the masculine pathway. In addition to this gene, which is able to turn females into males, another gene on the X chromosome, the chromosome one typically associates with femaleness, called DAX1, when present in double copy in a male, XY transforms into female. Thus, gender identity is the summary of the overall genetic makeup and hormones, which provide a blueprint of how the body is supposed to function. Evidence suggests that differences in verbal and spatial abilities, memory, and aggression are linked to differences in hormone secretions between males and females. In an article by Burke called "In Pursuit of Difference: Scientific Studies of Women and Men," it is suggested that human brains and hormone secretions have mutual influence. During the early stage of fetal development, specific hormones will enter the brain and permanently affect how the hypothalamus works. As before, high levels of hormones known as androgens will stop the hypothalamus from ever organizing hormone cycles. If there are low levels, then it will be cyclic. This early influence on brain determines the different frequency of hormone secretion later in male or female's life. Obviously, women's sex hormones usually follow a monthly cycle, while men's sex hormones do not follow such a pattern. This mutual influences between hormones and brains well illustrate the hormonal impact on gender identity. Research suggests that same hormones that allow for differentiation between sex organs in utero also elicit puberty as well as influence the development of gender identity. Different amounts of these male or female sex hormones within a person will result in varied behavior and external genitalia that do not match up with the norm of the actual sex, and they may instead act and look like the opposite gender. Social and environmental factors also determine gender identity. Such factors would most evidently include the attitudes of the parents raising the child and the culture into which the children are raised. Parents and authoritative figures view sexuality and gender will determine the behaviors, interests, and self-identity of the children. Children learn by observation and reproduction and will repeat actions and ideas that they see from the adults in their lives. Parents who do not support gender nonconformity are more likely to have children with firmer and stricter views on gender identity and gender roles. Even when parents do support gender nonconformity, many will usually only support it to a point. Though recent literature suggests a trend towards less well-defined gender roles and identities, as studies of parental coding of toys as masculine, feminine, or neutral, indicating that parents are increasingly coding kitchens and in some cases dolls as neutral than exclusively feminine. Despite this, however, it was more common in Kane's research for parents to show negative responses to items, activities, or attributes that could be considered icons of femininity. And research has indicated clearly that many parents are working to accomplish gender with and for their sons is in a manner that distances those sons from any association with femininity. Somewhat conversely, it emerged in Kane's research that the connection between gender performance and sexual orientation was not spontaneously raised for daughters. Parents did not bring up concern for their girls being considered homosexual as a result of identifying with masculine qualities as they did when considering their sons identifying with feminine qualities. Traditional attributes and abilities of femininity, such as domestic skills, nurturance, and empathy, were particularly seen as cause for concern by parents, suggesting that gender conformity and heterosexuality are closely linked with hegemonic construction of masculinity. The environment in which a child is raised in regards to gender is created before the child is even born. Current technology like ultrasound allows parents to determine the biological sex of the child before birth and to alter their preparation for the child accordingly. This, of course, is banned in India. But if it is allowed, a child will typically arrive to a decided gender specific name, games, and even ambitions. When the child's sex is determined, most children are raised to be a man or a woman with the related social roles based on the parents' beliefs. Sociologist La Frenier states, by the time children are 3 to 4 years old, they've already formed an image of themselves as boy or girl. According to Kane, children themselves become active participants in this gendering process by the time they are conscious of the social relevance of gender, typically before the age of 2. Children form these thoughts through parents, teachers, peers, and the games and toys that they play with at a young age. Many parents invoke biology in explaining their children's gender tendencies, though in reality, children are going to act in ways that receive a positive response from their parents and will change their behavior accordingly if given a negative response, meaning that Kane's research has found the parental boundary maintenance work evident for sons represents a crucial obstacle from limited boys' options, separating boys from girls, devaluing activities marked as feminine for both boys and girls, and thus bolstering gender inequality and heteronormativity. Balancing gender roles and identity is not easy, and identity work is not something that just ends once one identifies as masculine or feminine. Gender identity work is done throughout one's life. Studies have deemed identity work successful if individuals manage to craft identities that sustain their self-esteem and grant them social validation in their roles. Nature versus nurture. The extent to which gender identity is determined by socialization, that is environmental factors, versus inborn, that is biological factors, is an ongoing debate in psychology and is known as nature versus nurture. While gender roles and sex differences are both largely recognized as influential in behavior, it is often difficult to determine the separate impacts of socialization and genetic variables. Although there may be discrepancies as to which factor plays the most important role, there is extensive agreement that a combination of many different views and perspectives are needed for a complete understanding of gender development. The idea of nature versus nurture has had quite an effect on gender identity. Nature has to do with the hormonal aspect and the genetic makeup. Certain genetic variations may produce gender variant identities. Gender identity development has genetic influence. The second aspect is nurture, which has to do with the environmental aspects and parental influence of genetic identity. Parents are the ones who create the values and behaviors that their children create. Most parents tend to surround their children with gender typed toys and clothes. One of the most known examples of nature versus nurture was the case of Reimer, otherwise known as John or Joan. As a baby, David went through a faulty circumcision, losing his male genitalia, and from then on, he was designed to be a girl. Psychologist Money convinced Reimer's parents to raise David as a girl. Reimer grew up as a girl, dressing in girl clothes, and was surrounded by girl toys. But he still felt as though something was wrong. David did not feel like a girl, and after trying to commit suicide by age 13, Reimer was then told he was born a boy. Once he was told the truth, he immediately went into surgery to get the proper genitalia back. This went against Mooney's idea that biology had nothing to do with gender identity or human sexual orientation. Adolescence and development of gender identity. During early to mid-adolescence, youth's understanding of gender is quite rigid and stereotyped. As a result, younger adolescents will typically participate in more gender stereotype behaviors than do older adolescents. This means that girls will gravitate more towards girly activities and present an ultra-feminine appearance, while guys will lean towards more guy activities and present an uber-masculine appearance. There are a number of reasons for these gender stereotype behaviors. First, teens' bodies have changed so much during puberty that their bodies now begin to resemble adult bodies. Of course, youth like some of these physical changes but dislike others. As a result, may want to enhance the physical changes they want desirable or appealing and downplay or conceal the changes they dislike. For instance, girls may enjoy shopping for bras that accentuate their new feminine figure, but they may also begin to use a great deal of cosmetics to conceal acne blemishes. Meanwhile, guys may be quite pleased with their new facial hair and relish their new shaving ritual, but insist upon spraying themselves with heavy colognes and deodorants to mask their new powerful body odor. Thus, some gender stereotype behaviors result from these efforts to play up or play down the physical changes to their bodies. Second, because teens are becoming more interested in dating and forming romantic relationships, they will perform stereotypic gender specific behaviors in an effort to be attractive to the opposite sex. In general, guys tend to be attracted to young ladies who have feminine hairstyles, feminine shaped bodies, feminine facial features, and feminine scents. Therefore, teen girls begin to spend a lot of time trying to achieve a feminine appearance by fixing their hair, applying makeup to emphasize rosy lips and cheeks, choosing feminine and or revealing clothing styles, and wearing scented lotions and sprays to make them smell nice. They do all of this in an effort to capture the guy's attention. Likewise, guys begin a lot of time enhancing their masculine appearance because the teen girls are generally attracted to guys who appear masculine, strong, tough and handsome. Guys may lift weights at the gym to enlarge their muscles, learn to play a masculine sport like football or skateboarding, and choose clothing they consider rugged and handsome. They do all of this in an effort to show the girls just how strong and masculine they are. Therefore, some increase in gender stereotype behavior results from these efforts to attract the opposite sex. Third, during early adolescence, friends and families will influence how teens express their gender. Thus, stereotypical behaviors are passed down from one generation to the next. When fathers, grandfathers, uncles, older brothers and friends tell youth what it means to be a man or describes what men are expected to do, this shapes youth's perception of masculinity and influences their behavior. An adolescent's transition into adulthood, their understanding of gender becomes much less rigid and more broadly defined. Nonetheless, the majority of youth will ultimately identify with the gender that corresponds to their biological sex. However, some youth will identify with both genders, and these youth are called transgendered, meaning they cross over both genders. Summary: gender identity refers to one's own subjective experience about one's gender. A strong nature versus nurture debate exists to explain the factors influencing the development of gender identity. Gender identity disorder refers to displeasure with one's biological sex and associated gender roles.